We constantly hear about Western involvement, Western values, and Western interests in the media. People say that the West is the best, or the West is in decline. Some country is either Westernizing or hates the West way of life. The West is the countries with democracies and free markets, right? Or the countries that are part of Western Civilization? Then what about Latin America? Are they Western? What does the West even mean? And what exactly is Western Civilization? Let's find out. To understand what Western Civilization is, we'll have to look at its 5,000-year history, which I'm going to try and summarise in a few hundred words. I'll start with the Greeks, who are considered the traditional founders of Western civilization, and the people that gave the West a lot of its central values, such as citizen participation in government, the disciplines of science, philosophy and history, and the basis of Western architecture. The Greeks, or at least each Greek city-state, had an identity based on some of these ideas, except Sparta, whose identity was based on death and sweet abs. People such as Homer, Socrates and Hippocrates are all titans in the fields of Western literature, philosophy and medicine. They essentially kickstarted it. Now don't get me wrong, an ancient Greek would be considered alien if we ever met one today, but the idea that Western civilization descends from the Greeks is just as important an idea to the West as an actual direct link. Obviously, modern Western civilization isn't the same as ancient Greek culture. Later, Westerners chose what they wanted to adopt and what they wanted to abandon. No one in the modern West is sacrificing goats to the gods and taking slaves just because the Greeks did it. The origins of the East-West division has roots in ancient Greece, specifically in the Persian Wars. It is in this conflict that we see the beginning of the liberty-loving masculine West versus the despotic, decadent and feminine East trope, a trope that we still see on screen today. One of the most important things that Greece did for the West was influence Rome. Rome gave the West the foundations for its government, its languages and its laws. The Roman law code was the basis for the legal systems of most of Europe and its colonies up until the 18th and 19th centuries. Rome provided the West with an identity, firstly through its empire and then through its church. Christianity held the West together after Rome faded, and would mould its identity up until the 19th century. Christianity became the religion of Rome shortly after the Emperor Constantine had adopted it. But just as important in the history of the West is something else that Constantine did, and that was establishing the city of Constantinople. You see, the Roman Empire had a cultural divide. The West spoke Latin, and the East spoke Greek. So, the Romans began thinking with a Latin versus Greeks mindset. The Latins saw the Greeks as more effeminate and decadent compared to how manly and tough they were, which added to the whole East versus West idea. Which is funny because the Greeks thought the exact same in relation to themselves to the Persians. The Roman Empire eventually divided along these lines. The western half faded away in the 5th century, and the eastern Byzantine half lasted another 1,000 years. In 1054, the western and eastern churches split from each other in an event known as the Great Schism. I'm not going to go into detail about the Great Schism because it deserves to be a video in itself, but the important takeaway is that after 1054, the Catholic Church separated from the Eastern Orthodox Church. A pope sat in Rome and a patriarch sat in Constantinople. The Eastern Roman Empire would eventually spread Orthodox Christianity into the Levant, the Balkans, and importantly, they converted the Rus. This schism, in combination with the Islamic conquest that began 3 centuries previously, gave the West its own identity. They were now West Christendom. They may not have liked each other, but they knew they hated the Eastern heathens and Muslims even more. Constantinople would fall to the Ottomans in 1453, and afterwards the Greek, Roman and Islamic knowledge that they had accumulated and preserved was brought back to Europe by scholars and merchants. The Renaissance, with all its fancy naked statues, got into full swing. The West began to re-import Western civilization, with all the additions the Byzantines, Muslims and others had made to it. This rebirth of Western culture came along just before the discovery of the New World. So the Europeans, now confident that their ideas and culture were superior, began to colonize the New World. This is the beginning of the spread of the West, and also the reason why the West is such a hard term to quantify today. By colonizing and imposing their culture on other nations, the West ended up in the northern, southern and eastern parts of the world, which is confusing for a group that identifies as a position on the compass. If you'd like to learn more about how the West managed to conquer so much, then click that little eye in the top right corner to go to a great video by Grant Hurst. During the Enlightenment, the Western idea of a nation-state developed. During this era, European imperialism was brought to Africa and Asia, and as Westerners translated Eastern languages and interacted with the East more, a kind of Orientalism began depicting the East as an irrational, psychologically weak and feminized other, which was negatively contrasted with the West's idea of itself as rational, psychologically strong and masculine. This nation-state concept was imposed on places where it didn't really belong, resulting in odd, perfectly straight borders. The Enlightenment dulled the idea of West Christendom and birthed the secular West. This is where the West actually began calling itself the West, and also using that term to describe previous cultures like the Greeks and Romans. Skipping forward slightly, after the Second World War, the West lost its colonial power mostly, and the world entered the Cold War, which was an easy conflict to paint in terms of East v West, communism v capitalism. The Western identity solidified during this period. Who was Western and who wasn't was clear. But after the Cold War ended, I think the term the West lost that solid meaning, but it still continued to be used. So what exactly does the West mean today? How do you define it? Here are the usual economic, political and cultural definitions. Economically, the West is usually developed countries with strong economies and high incomes. Here it's used interchangeably with First World. Politically, it's countries with democratic governments and free citizens, and here it's used interchangeably with Free World. And culturally, it's countries with roots in Europe and the Greco-Roman Judean tradition that was built upon by the ideals of the Enlightenment, usually referred to as Western Civilization. But these definitions aren't actually great for defining the West. For example, let's look at Latin America. Latin America, much like the United States and Canada, are inheritors of Western civilization through their European colonizers. Latin America, however, is rarely included when people speak about the West. They speak Latin languages, and while there are some Latin countries such as Bolivia, Paraguay and Guatemala that have strong native influence, they are still heavily influenced by the culture of their colonizers. If you look at this Human Development Index map, you can see that there are many Latin American states that are in the high to very high range, especially Argentina, Chile and Uruguay. Their political institutions and governments are based on the same principles as European ones. Democratic governments are the norm in Latin America, and most rank just below the US and Europe on the Democracy Index. Latin America is definitely part of Western civilization and should really be included when people speak about the West. You can try and apply those three criteria to other nations too, like Japan, Turkey and the nations that were previously behind the Iron Curtain, to see if they match up with the idea of the West. And that brings me to my final point, criticisms of the term the West. An issue with the term the West, other than its vagueness, is that it implies confrontation. West of where? Different than where? Edward Said claimed that the West was just a construct used by Europeans to justify an opposition to the East, which could then justify colonialism. You see, the West usually defined itself by what it's not. It wasn't the Persians, it wasn't the Greeks or the Orthodox, it wasn't Islamic or Chinese or Indian, it wasn't Russian or communist, and now it's not Islamic again? The notion of an Eastern other has played a central role in constructing a Western identity, and helped to define the West as its contrasting image, which nowadays doesn't make sense because cultures and societies are mixing and learning from each other on an unprecedented scale. The West and the East need each other, as our economies and societies will collapse without the other. Western civilization as a term is just an attempt to record the history of a cultural unit in an easily understandable and linear fashion, and it mostly does the job. But the West as a term is simply used to refer to a blurry area in the map in people's minds, which is why it's useful for the news or for politicians. It's just vague enough to appear to mean something. So when you hear someone refer to the decline of the West or how a group of people hate the West, think, what are they referring to? What West? Is all of Europe, the Americas, Australia and New Zealand all in decline? Have people stopped reading Plato? Do these people that apparently hate the West simply hate whoever they see as their enemy, or do they actually hate all of the places that might be in the West? Even Liechtenstein? Can you really hate Liechtenstein? The purpose of this video isn't to demand that we begin to use different terms for anything, but it can be useful to know where certain terms came from and why they continue to be used. Kipling said that East is East and West is West and never the twain shall meet, except that they have, and both are different and better than before. Thanks for watching. This video was made in collaboration with Grant Hurst. If you'd like to learn about how the West managed to colonize so much of the world, then check out his video. While you're at it, check out his channel, he makes really good content. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you'd like to see more, click subscribe. You can follow me on Reddit, Twitter and Facebook, and don't forget to check out my sources in the description down below if you'd like to learn more. There are also links in the description to Cogito merchandise if you'd like to further support the show.